Third-time Wyoming Republican Liz Cheney will likely lose her primary election Tuesday after being the party's leading anti-Trump figure. Ryan, will it be a bloodbath?
Looks like it. I mean, the polls have her, the polls that have been released have her down by some 30 points or so. So it's not looking good at all for Representative Liz Cheney. Although calling her Wyoming Republican Liz Cheney is almost a bit of a stretch. She launched her campaign and in her campaign first ad on Facebook where she launched it, she tagged it McLean, Virginia, because she posted from her home in McLean, where she grew up, where her father lived. Her father represented Wyoming briefly in the House of Representatives, but spent most of his career in Washington, where she has spent most of her life. I'm torn here because now you're gonna have Liz Cheney as a free agent. You're gonna probably see her on MSNBC a lot. You're gonna have people floating her constantly as a vice presidential candidate, or maybe even a presidential candidate, or teaming. Just all sorts of just grotesqueries that'll be thrown out hypothetically. Almost rather have her just as a backbench, non-Republican Republican. I mean, how are you feeling about this?
Well, I'm curious, to what you attribute her loss. Is it just the simple story of she was too critical of Donald Trump in a political environment that is not at all friendly to those who openly antagonize Donald Trump? Or is it something else? You mentioned the fact that she's not really seen as someone who is local to the state. You do such good coverage over at The Intercept of these races that often get kind of superficially covered as, well, this is a progressive win, or this is a moderate win, or the blue dogs have it and the progressives don't. But oftentimes there's other stories going on, whether it's the influence of dark money campaigns, the funding differences between candidates, whether or not they've run the kind of advertisements that appeal to locals about fixing streets and traffic signals and things like that. Do you have any insight as to whether or not there are things other than Donald Trump that have motivated this outcome?
I do think it's fair to say that she started from a more brittle place than people think. She tried to run for Senate in her first bid and just got completely annihilated. The only way that she managed to win the House race is that it was an open primary. Somebody had stepped down, and so she had massive name recognition given that she's a Cheney, and so she was able to squeak through that, move through a Republican primary that way. And once you're in, unless there's some kind of tectonic shift in politics. And I think ultimately, whether or not she would have had to have a much firmer standing in Wyoming to withstand what has happened. And a lot of this comes back to the tribal nature of our politics and also our media. That she is seen as a Democrat. She is seen there as having sided with the enemy, having sided with Democrats. And when it comes to the media that her voters are consuming, they don't see this as a 50-50 question. They see this as Trump was right. The media is lying about January 6th and everything else about Trump. And here she is siding with the media elites and with Democrats, and that's just intolerable. And so the only other perhaps possibility she had is if the kind of anti-Cheney elements didn't consolidate around a single kind of opponent, but they have. So given all of that, she's in huge trouble.
I definitely echo your concerns about what it means for her to be a free agent. Obviously, MSNBC has become the landing ground of choice for people from failed Republican administrations to get cushy media jobs and kind of have the public memory hold the extent to which they were originally Republican to begin with. Some of the most visible representatives of the erstwhile left really are people like Nicole Wallace, former Bush administration comms woman and people like that. And I wonder if you see any parallel, because I've heard this argument made to me over the past week or so. There's an argument that people like myself on the left, people like yourself, who are critical of liberals who would embrace Liz Cheney despite her broader record just because of her willingness to be critical of Donald Trump, that there's a parallel between those liberals and progressives who will say things like Marjorie Taylor Greene is right about abolishing the FBI, or on her stance on Julian Assange. Do you think that's a fair criticism to say you can't be mad at liberals for embracing Liz Cheney if you're willing to give credit, as it were, to other members of the right who from time to time align with leftist interests?
I think it's all about, how you do it and why you do it, and I see you're making a veiled reference to one of your own things, and I saw your interview, some of your interview last night with Cenk, where you kind of explained your point that you're not trying to convert, you're not trying to convert Marjorie Taylor Greene, and liberals, let's give them the best faith that you possibly can. They're not trying to convert Liz Cheney. What they're trying to do is say, look, even you Republicans should be ashamed of yourselves, because even Liz Cheney agreed, even Liz Cheney, who is a member of the Cheney dynasty, even she agrees with us that Trump ought to be impeached, that this was an insurrectional, whatever they're trying to pull from her. As to me, as long as it stays in that rhetorical space and that kind of pre-coalition space, that's totally fine. You're using somebody as an example of doing something right in order to shame other people into doing that right thing. If you then go from there and say, oh, and Liz Cheney, by the way, she's also right that there should be no corporate income tax and that there isn't a country in this planet that we shouldn't be invading. And that becomes the danger, that once people like her and her kind of neoconservative wing of the party start hearing all of these nice things from Democrats, that they don't then change their politics, but they end up changing the politics of the Democratic Party, which is already susceptible to some of her kind of Cheney-style warmongering. So on the flip side, as long as you're just saying, look, here you have Marjorie Taylor Greene saying good things about X. You should be ashamed. What are you doing, letting this faction of the Republican Party, which is not operating in good faith, take the lead on this? We should be taking the lead on this. I've made that point often, say with antitrust. If you ever see kind of eccentric Republicans who will come forward with some type of antitrust or big tech criticism that is valid, say, hey, Democrats, do not let them own this. Look what they're saying. They're right about this. They're odious for the most part, but they're right about this. So what you ought to do is embrace this antitrust position so that you don't lose it to them. Now, if you go beyond that and say the other things that the other things that they say must have some credibility to them as well. And then finally, I thought your point that you're not, what I said earlier, you're not trying to convince Liz Cheney, you're not trying to convince Marjorie Taylor Greene, you're trying to convince well-meaning supporters of theirs that say, look, we agree on this point, but they're wrong on the rest of it, so come our way. I don't know, how do you feel about the parallel there?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I also think there's an interesting question as to whether or not that kind of, shaming of your cohort, how could you let the other side do better on this issue than our own side? It has varying effectiveness depending on how credible that person is within their own cohort, right? So to the extent that Liz Cheney isn't really perceived to be a real Republican at this point, sure, it's going to have diminishing returns if you're trying to shame people on the basis of her being a model Republican. And I think you can make the same case for someone like Marjorie Taylor Greene. Is she so marginal that saying, hey, even Marjorie Taylor Greene is right on this doesn't exactly convince people? I don't know. I happen to think that because we're talking to a left audience about someone who is so far right being right on an issue, that it actually has a lot of effect. But broadly speaking, I think you very well articulated my take on this, and that there's a big difference between saying, we should be better on X, Y, and Z issue than someone who doesn't have the credibility or who doesn't have the goodwill or who doesn't have the historical perspective as we do. But also, let's not float them as a VP candidate for our own party. Right. That's where I draw the line as Liz Cheney for Democratic vice president or presidential aspirations.
So I'm reading now Mehdi Hasan's new book that's coming out pretty soon on how to make an argument. And one of the points that he's one of the best debaters, in the history of debating. And he actually makes this point that if you're trying to reach a particular audience, that you want to source your information to somebody that audience trusts. And,
Right.
and the example that he uses, he says, and the line he says he uses all the time is, don't take my word for it. And so when he's talking about immigration, he'll say, don't take my word for it. And then he quotes Ronald Reagan from the 1980s in this famous speech that he gave near the Statue of Liberty, talking about how immigrants are really the lifeblood of this country. And it's an eloquent passage that he then recites from Reagan. And when you drop Reagan on the right wing audience, then all of a sudden they're open to hearing what else you have to say about immigration. That doesn't mean that you endorse everything else that Reagan believes.
Right. I think that's exactly right. I look forward to reading that book, Ryan, and we will have more Rising for Everybody right after this.